A warm welcome to everyone. My name's Dan Clayton. I'm the head of school for Geography and Sustainable Development. I'm just simply here to wish you that warm welcome and to pass over to Professor Lisa Finney, who's going to do the fuller introduction to our guest today, Professor Dorling from the University of Oxford.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome, everybody. It's really wonderful to see you all here this afternoon. As Dan said, I'm Lisa Finney, Professor of Human Geography here in the school. And it's my pleasure to chair this public lecture this afternoon. We have a treat in store, I can assure you. We're prepared to be entertained and provoked. And that is part of the aim of this afternoon, I think. But before I get to the introduction, I want to thank colleagues who have organised this event, so go to Luke, William McBean, Helen Ayers and Claire Ford. Thanks to them, because there is some work that goes on behind the scenes for these kinds of events. So how is this going to work? Danny is going to speak for around 45 minutes, and after that we'll have plenty of time for your questions, your thoughts, your reflections. So please do note those down as we're going along. Don't be shy. Danny loves a good interrogation, and we'll come to those questions after he's spoken. So I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Dan Dorling, 1971 Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford, where he's been since 2013. Professor Dorling is a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, of the Royal Society of Arts and the Academy of Social Sciences. He held the position of Honorary President of the Society of Cartographers for a decade from 2007. Danny studied geography, maths and statistics and gained his BSc and PhD from the University of Newcastle, where he also undertook his initial postdoctoral fellowships. He then went on to hold academic posts at the universities of Leeds, Sheffield, before moving to Oxford. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome Danny to give this lecture because he is some might say, the champion of geography. And a champion of asking questions using numbers and using maps in all their very creative and very powerful forms. Danny is a generous academic, generous with ideas, generous with conversation, generous in his convictions, and there's no doubt that he has inspired many students and scholars, and I'm sure that he will do that today as well. Danny has published hundreds of papers, reports, commentaries since the early 1990s across the subjects of core interest to population and social geographers: migration, housing, work, health and death, and ethnicity. But throughout, Danny has maintained an interest in method as well as message, and has an inherent consciousness of the politics of statistics. I think that's something we'll think about a little bit today as well. Danny is now renowned for his combination of creative and engaging visualization of data, together with curiosity about social change and social inequality. He is a prolific writer, averaging, at my count, about 2 books a year over the last decade. It really is quite remarkable. Most recently, he's written Shattered Nation, Inequality and the Geography of a Failing State in 2023, 7 Children, Inequality and Britain's Next Generation in 2024, and coming out from Verso in May this year, The Next Crisis, What We Think About the Future. And it's this theme that Danny will speak on this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Professor Danny Dorling.
Thank you ever so much, Nissa, for that very kind introduction. Can you hear me at the back okay? Yeah. Great. This is a talk about a book. It's the 4th time I've done the talk. It normally takes about 10 or 12 attempts before you feel, at least yourself, you've got it right.
So you're going to get a few slides, but not too many. When you get better at this, the number of slides go down and the arm waving kind of increases. I'm not there yet. You'll also see, the first time I gave this talk was the University of Bristol Geography Department. Second time was Cheltenham College and Cheltenham Ladies College, from which I received an email just an hour ago with the subject Action Required, asking me to answer a series of things they thought I'd got wrong, which is great. And I will answer very politely tonight, having thought carefully about it. But please, if you want to send me an email, do. The third time I gave the talk was at Unison branch in Surrey, which is why the very last line there is about what unions can do to help. But some of you may be in a trade union too. I'm trying to write about optimistic things. That may seem odd, talking about the next crisis, but I think I'll show you in a minute why I'm trying to do this. And I always use empirical data. The data this book is based on mostly is from Ipsos's surveys of what people worry about in the world, which they publish every month publicly, have done so for many years. They didn't used to include China, so I've used data from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. They do include India, they include South Africa, about 30 countries. So what you're going to see is partly based on believing the answers to these international surveys about what most people worry about. And the spoiler is that most people don't worry about climate change, which is always a surprise if you're in a geography department and if you're in the UK. I'll show you in a minute part of the reason why we do worry about climate change. Climate change, by the way, absolutely real, very, very frightening, in case you think you're going to get anything that exciting. You know, you're not sitting in a lecture theatre where you're going to hear the news. It was all made up. Extinction, asteroids hitting us, AI. These just don't feature in most people. By most people, I mean most of the world's middle class. The kind of people who answer surveys. Which is not... which is... Because if you think about it, for the poorest half of people in the world, about 4 billion people, it's not that difficult to ascertain the concerns of the poorest half of people in the world. They literally are, how will I get enough food next week? How secure is my shelter? Possibly concerns about, does God love me? But really, you know, international issues don't feature that highly. That's the cover of the book. The key thing is it's got yellow in it. That matters, if this clicks forward, because the last few books have all been red and black and so on. Red and black is a traditional colour for academics of my kind, but we've lived through some pretty depressing years in the UK, and I'm not complaining too much, but there comes a point when you write so many books about, you know, you wouldn't believe it, and now another thing. You know, we've managed to hit the top of the World League table for rising child poverty. We have increases in hunger. We have a country falling apart more than any other country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria. But they actually had elections for their 3 most recent prime ministers. We've only managed 1 election. I couldn't moan on and on. But that's moaning that I've been doing in the last 10 years is mainly because I'm in the UK. You might think that everything is terrible everywhere else, but if you measure it, it often isn't. You can at least be grateful that you're not sitting in the United States right now. Hopefully I've upset somebody going, don't I know that Elon Musk has got the right plan and that America's going to be made great again? But, you know, there are worse places to be in the rich world. I've been at the University of Oxford now for 13 years. On Friday, as I was travelling up on the train, I saw the first ever cascaded down travel warning given by the university. And I opened it up and it was about Foreign Office advice about travelling into a country. I thought, oh, where's it going to be? Is it going to be going somewhere in Africa? Is it going to be yet another kind of worry about China? And I opened it up and no, the advice was, be very, very careful if you're travelling to the United States this Easter for an academic conference. Right? You couldn't have predicted that. make sure your visa is valid, make sure you're not doing anything. And I thought, oh, do my colleagues at the top of university are actually seriously worried of having their Easter holiday disturbed, trying to extradite a University of Oxford academic from JFK being held under some pretext. These are the state that we live in. You'll be glad to know that there are only going to be 16 slides. Some of them are a bit crowded, but there's only 16 of them. 2 are by way of introduction, 12, which are largely the graphics in the book, The Next Crisis, and a couple concluding. So I'm really interested in what you think. By way of introduction, I'm the kind of person who occasionally clicks on surveys. When you're sent a survey about what you think, most people don't answer surveys, and those surveys are in some ways largely pointless because they're so biased in terms of who fills them in. But this was a survey about how I cope as a climate change scientist with the problems of climate change. They assumed I was a climate change scientist because I work at the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, and we have a lot of climate change scientists. I'm not a climate change scientist. I had just finished writing a book about what people worry about in the world, and so I did fill in a series of answers that I hope are not too rude about how I actually managed to get to sleep at night and so on. But one of them was a writing box. I like these writing boxes. And the writing box was what makes me hopeful as a supposed climate scientist. And so what I did is cut and paste from a footnote of a book written by a geographer called Noel Castry, where he says that glib optimism is not what's called for, but equally our thinking cannot be too hemmed in by the current realities in an era when capitalism's maniacal addiction to growth is pitching us all into frightening new territory. Noel used to visit Prague a lot, one of his favourite cities, he says. It's a footnote, he doesn't expect anybody to quote it. As the former political dissident, the later Czech president, Václav Havel, once said, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. I'll let you read the rest if you want. I could have just given you the famous quote from Václav Havel about hope and about being optimistic, but I thought I'd put it in context. Geographers worry about these things. There was a second writing box, and I must get better batteries for my clicker. Let me move over here. There we go. The second question, towards the end of the survey, was what doesn't worry me about the future? After filling in a huge survey about all my worries about the planet, are there things that worry others that you don't feel you need to worry about? And my answer is, well, the list is very long of things that don't worry me. I'm very privileged. I have at least some idea about where I sit in the world income and wealth distribution. I'm a university academic. You may not think it, but we do live at a time of relative peace compared to most of the last 100 years, certainly most of the last 200 years. Wars are increasing in the world, terrible things are going on in the world, but at the moment, right here, right now, not so bad. Depends where you draw the line. I try to understand the worries of others, but clearly our capacity for empathy, for actually feeling what other people feel, is to some extent limited. I don't want to upset any of you if I don't appear to care about what you care about enough. And there may be things I care about that it annoys you that I do care about them. We're going to find out. It's going to be lots of time for questions. And they'd need a bigger box if asked to list all the things that people worry about that I don't. I don't worry about AI particularly. Maybe I should. I'm an old academic. This is the 4th AI revolution in my life. You begin to get cynical. Each one was incredible. The first, I was only just born, so I only knew about it in hindsight. I won't go through them. I can easily get distracted. And as you can tell, I'm very arrogant. I think I can know about AI and computing and all different kinds of things. You have to be a bit arrogant to write a book about crises. It helps to be a bit arrogant in some ways to be a geographer. You know, the subject in Britain was about knowing about seas and rivers and mountains and where you get coal from and how you build a city and how you organise people and everything from what kind of soils grow plants correctly through to how does the class system work, right? It's a really interesting subject. Why was it so all-encompassing when my department began in 1899? Because what it was doing was training colonial officers. And if you've got to run a country, you need to know a lot of things. Geography could have died as a discipline, could have shrunk to the size of anthropology, its sister discipline. But fortunately for geography, unfortunately for the planet, something I was taught in my geography A-level turned out not to be true. I was taught, when I did my A-level in the 1980s, that the world was cooling and an ice age was coming. Right? There will be things, there are some people I think doing A-levels here, there will be things you are taught in your A-level which will turn out the opposite will be true. Geographers played their part in discovering that we weren't imminently entering an ice age by, I put it cynically, going on holiday in the summers to the Alps and climbing up to the bottom of glaciers to measure how quickly they were coming down. Now, it took us a little bit of time and quite a few summers to realise that the things weren't coming down, they were going backwards. But that, in a way, was part of the reason why you still have geography departments. Some people have written some nice things about the book. I'm not quite sure they would agree with all of it, but there is some blurb for you. And the book comes out in May. So just 12 slides, sometimes with 2 graphs on a slide. The first thing is crises. This first black and white graph there. It's the sense of crises. When did it begin? We're now in a mega crisis, a poly crisis, a crisis all the time kind of crisis. This graph, by the way, ends in 2019, just before a really big crisis that kind of, you know, a little bit of news in December 2019, if you remember. A little bit more in January 2020. February 2020 was kind of interesting, but, you know, other side of the world. Remember St. Patrick's Day? March 2020? Okay. When they update this graph, it's going to be really interesting watching just how high up the scale can it go. But you can look at that graph. It's incidences of the word crisis being used in the English language in all the books that the oligarchs have scanned, or whatever, however they put it. And if you were to believe that the graph represents reality, then for decades and decades, things were pretty good, no crises. There were actually pandemics and epidemics of typhoid and cholera and a huge flu in 1918-19. And there were wars after war after war, and there were general strikes and depressions, but no crises, not very much. And then in the 1960s, and there was a crisis to do with Cuba and missiles, you begin to get a ramping up, and then again and again at the use of the word crisis. One possibility is that things actually became stable enough in terms of violence, insecurity, the actual reality of will your children, or at least your sons, be required to put on a uniform and take a gun and go marching? Will the harvest fail? Will you run out? Will there be a new pox that comes to get you? Things actually become stable enough, and we, in the English-speaking world, become affluent enough that we can worry about things more, which is really good. It isn't that we've been living through an age of unbelievable crises in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 1990s, and 2000s. This is the graph I most dislike from Our World in Data. And I'm hoping that if the book achieves only one thing, my colleagues at Oxford who run Our World in Data might alter this graph. This is a graph of, I call it the nothing to worry about here graph. It's a graph about how something came along and suddenly the vast majority of the people in the world were no longer poor and poverty's going down. And, you know, look at that amazing change. You've now got billions of people in the green area, not many in the brown area. People aren't having to live on $1.90 a day or the equivalent anymore. It's all good. Now, the cynical thing about that, and you'll see why I think this graph is completely wrong in a minute, is that in the green area is everybody from somebody begging at the train station, maybe getting, if they're not very good at begging, £3 a day, to Elon Musk. They're all in the green. Okay, and not in the other. The book has an introduction, and then it has 8 chapters. 7 of those chapters are arranged about crises, and the crises are ordered by who worries about them most, how many people, how severe the effects of those crises are. So it's my ordering, my take, but based on data. Whether something's a crisis does partly depend on how near is it to you and how near is it in time. And you may disagree on this, but it also depends very much on you. If none of these things affect you very much, there's probably something you worry about, and it'll be different. And I should, by the way, most of you right now, or I hope, are probably not worrying about world crises. Right? You're worrying about what you're going to have for tea. How long is he going to keep on talking? Does the person I really like me? Those kind of things. You know, if you're not worrying about that, you're slightly odd. You know, that's what human beings do. We don't tend to have in our head a whole series of things we worry about all at the same time. We do tend to worry. We're very good at worrying, remarkably good at worrying. We're a pro-social animal that looks after each other. We feel happy typing laptops in a cafe with other people around us. Right? This is a good thing. We have eyes set back because we're designed to see the wolf coming to eat us. Right? We constantly worry about things going wrong, which is part of the reason why we managed to avoid them going as bad as they could. We are worriers, but we vary in our worry. This list here is the core of the book. Ipsos ask about 18 topics consistently to want to include China to the majority of the world's population every month. The wording matters. Which 3 of these following topics do you find the most worrying in your country? So the wording isn't saying for the world or for you, it's for your country. And this is the percent mentioned. I've done something to show it wobbles around a bit, but we don't have time to worry about that. They go up and down slightly. The biggest worry in the world, and it's 2 I combine, the biggest is inflation, and the second biggest is poverty and social inequality. Inflation came up as the biggest worry during the pandemic, began to rise and rise and rise. The cost of living crisis. The fact that for us, everything costs 30% more than it did 3 years ago. Right? And that's true in much of the world. And that worries most people. Because most people are only just getting by. Most middle-class people are only just getting by. If you're sitting here not worrying about inflation at all, even though inflation is now down to whatever percent, it hasn't gone negative, it hasn't returned, then you're in a lucky position of being in a tiny minority of people who don't have to worry much about the rent or the mortgage or the food or your clothes. Middle-class people. So inflation is at the top. But it's very linked to what has been at the top for a decade. This is when people around the world are asked. And when they're asked, they say poverty and inequality. Right? They absolutely shock you. It is partly the work of academics. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, Michael Marmot, that lot. You have to take your hat off to them a bit. You know, they were involved in publicising that the bigger the gap between you and the country, the worse things were, that poverty actually really matters. So that our world in data graph saying it's gone away as a problem doesn't mean it's gone away. You know, 1 in 4 children in Scotland are growing up in poverty, right? One of the highest rates in Europe, and the lowest rate in Britain. Every region of England has a worse child poverty rate now than Scotland. things change. But your child poverty rate in Scotland is still appalling by international standards. Majority of children who've got a brother and a sister have got 2 siblings or more, but normally just 2. The majority are going hungry 3 or 4 times a month. Seriously hungry, not peckish, actually going to bed hungry, there's not enough food. And normally their mother is going much more hungry because she tries to make sure they're not hungry. That's the UK we live in. The exact statistic is 56%. It was produced by Torsten Bell. Torsten Bell had a bad week last week. He's now a Member of Parliament for Swansea. Torsten was trying to explain why it didn't matter that he couldn't live off the £70 a week that his government were going to take people down to. Right? But these are international surveys. This isn't the UK, this is all countries. But in the UK, it's way up there. 10 years ago, there was a bigger worry than unemployment. It's now the 3rd biggest in the world, it's unemployment. And you can go down the list. I won't read it all out for you. But the key thing is that climate change ain't up there. It's on the list, but it ain't up there at the top. And in fact, it's been dropping over time, even as the planet's been heating up. There's a fatigue. What I've done is I've merged these. And I've merged them because when you write these books, there's a formula. You have 8 chapters, you might have 9. You always write one at the end about how everything can be solved, and it's normally very short because that isn't easy to do. You assume that people won't read chapters 5, 6 and 7, so you can say what you really think there. It's just an incentive to read chapters 5, 6 and 7. But anyway, you have to do books in this way. But also these things are related. So I've taken inflation and cost of living and poverty and social inequality. The first chapter is about those. By far the biggest issue for the world's middle class. And the higher up you go, by the way, in the income scale, the more people are obsessed by the fact they haven't got enough, which may sound strange, but the higher you go up, the better off you are, the more inequality there is in the group you live in. So when I do talks to schools, the greatest inequalities I ever see are at the most elite public schools in England. Everybody's well off, but some families have 100 times more than others. Whereas if I go to an average school, the gaps between children's parents are much narrower. University professors are absolutely obsessed with what other university professors are paid. You know, just to annoy everybody, to annoy my academic colleagues, we're offered, say, 1% or 2%, and we're out there on picket lines going, you know, this is unfair, inflation's at this, we're sinking back, rectify the anomaly, pay us more. Standing outside buildings, in my case a building of 500 employees, of which we're by far the highest paid, with our sign saying we're not paid enough. Right? The actual interest in inequality rises the better off people get. That's going to be chapter 2. You're only going to get one slide on that. Chapter 3 is about unemployment, and I put in immigration there because I think the two things are closely related. Fears about immigration tend to be about people taking away the work. It's about what am I going to do? Am I needed? Whereas the first great concern is how am I going to get by? Then violence, normally crime, normally robbery, normally theft. This really worries people. If you're not worrying about violence or crime or theft, that's good because the chances are pretty low, but it's a real concern. And I've put in war there and terrorism and those other related things. They vary very geographically, and in time, if you're in a country next to a war zone, you're going to worry a lot more about war. And then chapter 5, the fourth one is cradle to graves issue. This is actually the top concern in China. Even though China is as unequal as the United States, there is a sense in which everything is so much better than it was, and everybody's got better off. The inequality and poverty isn't at the top. Unemployment is not at the top because there are lots of jobs in China, although university academics are worried that the good times are over. Growth is only 6% a year. It's terrible. The lowest it's been for decades. Imagine only 6% a year growth. Not a worry in China. War is not a worry in China. You know, the United States and us, well, I think our aircraft carrier never made it to the South China Sea. We have an aircraft carrier we can't afford to run. But not to worry. So the biggest concern amongst the population of China is what the state's providing, and healthcare in particular. Elderly population, and a situation in which you might have to bribe your way to get treated in the hospital. I'm always careful about saying these things because I do want to be allowed back into China. But, it's worth the Chinese state looking at why is access to healthcare the biggest concern of your population. Okay? Not bullet trains. The bullet trains are great, right, but not that. And then climate crisis. And I only get climate crisis in chapter 6 by amalgamating the other worries. And then biodiversity. And I only have biodiversity, the environment, in because I'm a geographer and I work in a department with people who think this is by far the biggest problem. And who tell me when I show them this list that the question was framed wrongly, which is not the right response. You can ask a question where you say, there are lots of trivial things which aren't that important, but really you should be worrying about biodiversity and just about get people. But really, when the population is surveyed repeatedly and they don't tell you they're concerned about being in the 6th biggest mass extinction event on the planet, you have to take some account of them actually telling you that that isn't their concern, even if you think that should be their concern. Let's not say much about this. As I told you, I have too much detail in the slides, but if there's anybody who hates these kind of talks and likes reading really quickly, I can leave these things up for a minute. Why did the world in data graph change as it did? Well, one answer is China. We're not very good at talking about China. We got better recently. One advantage of what's going on in the States is it's quite hard to paint that other very large, rich country as the bogey person when the other one, change in positions in China, but also dramatic reduction in having children. And if you have dramatic reduction in having children in the world, particularly in poorer families, you get fewer people who are living in the poorest families. Right? It isn't that poverty went away, it's that people being born into poverty reduced. And of course the poverty is still absolutely there. It's just that you're not okay if you've got $2.5 a day to live on, or $10. Right? It's the wrong definition of poverty. Sharing the work. This is UK data. Of many, many things that are polled in the UK as to what are the greatest concern, only 4 in a very long period of time, I'm only showing you from 2012, only 4 have ever become the biggest concern of people. And they were, at various points, Britain leaving the UK, leaving the EU. That's a slip to make in Scotland. Britain leaving the EU. People concerned that we wouldn't, people concerned that we would. And you can see from the graph the period at which that, It's interesting how we forget our, you may remember that period. Health is the grey line. And shortly, luckily for the Brexiteers, very shortly after we left the EU, we stopped worrying so much about leaving the EU because we were worried we're going to die. Because there was a virus coming with a death rate which we didn't know what it was. And these things are always kind of under there. The economy, to knock out the economy, which is generally fear for the future, does require some big events. And then you've got that immigration and asylum, which shortly before the referendum manages to become the most salient issue, the one people worry about the most. Not least because newspapers did produce an enormous number of headlines about the terrible migrants that are coming. The quote is very sad. The quote is from an academic colleague in another country. I have had so many emails from people of my age, because we're expensive, but also because of the cuts that are happening, going on. So when I tell you that unemployment is the second biggest crisis in the world, and you're working in a university, you've got a sense of it now because of what's happening. University of Dundee, not very far away from here, but almost all the universities of the UK. But unemployment is always a fear of everybody but the very most self-confident, right? And there's a danger, because our newspaper articles and our books tend to be written by people who are pretty self-confident at a time when their lives are going well. There's a danger that we actually ignore the fears of the majority of the people around us. too much information too fast for you. I just can't work out what I'm going to cut out when I do this, but just look at the middle one. Now, and there are great differences. If you're very quick, you can look at Sweden, where actual crime in Sweden is the biggest concern. Partly because, a bit like China, Sweden life's been pretty good, but there's now gang-related violence in Stockholm. Nothing by US standards or even London standards, but still a bit of a shock. That's a map, just getting you to look at data. Some very nice Swedes, it's connected. Some very nice Swedes have dedicated their entire lives to counting up the number of people who die in wars and war-related incidences and what is a war. And that is the map of who's died since 1989 to 2022. It wouldn't look that different. One circle will double in size, but not the biggest circle. It's interesting to look at who suffers most from one of the things that we're really fearful of. And war is one where you can ask questions in a different way and get it very high. It's possible to get polls that show the majority of the population are worried about imminent nuclear war if you ask the question right, and Russia's being particularly belligerent about something to do with Ukraine in the month before you do it. But in terms of wars, I look at that distribution of war deaths and war-related deaths. Most of those wars were not started really by people in those countries. They were orchestrated from outside. These are great powers. The weapons used in most of the cases to kill people were not manufactured in those countries. They're outside. There's a kind of huge injustice going on when you step back and look at who is it that we allow to suffer from wars. The good news side to that war graph is just how well we have protected ourselves in rich countries from suffering in general from war. Wars in which we're involved in those other wars, but you won't see many rich countries there. The number of people dying from wars began to rise, ironically, almost at the point that Steven Pinker published his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, about how violence was disappearing. So you've got to be careful making any prophecies about things. Cradle to the grave concerns. And these are interesting, and I've only got about 5 minutes left. These are interesting because often the concerns are not greatest in the places where they should be. Like I told you, this is the major concern in China. It's not the major concern in the United States. But these graphs are all about, the first one is just showing you how many more times likely you are to die in a year if you live in the US as compared to affluent countries. It's unbelievable. This one here was done by John Byrne Murdoch. And it shows that even the richest 1% of people in the US, which includes the people who are going to freeze their bodies and do everything else, they're not even living a month more than our richest 1%, or our meaning, in my case, England. And we have one of the worst health records in Europe now. Right? So there are all kinds of crises, there are health crises, but just because there is a crisis doesn't necessarily mean that people say it is a crisis. What do people think and what do they say? So it's a book about looking at opinions and polls and worries. YouGov did a really interesting survey at the end of 2020, reported in January, where they asked people about a series of conspiracy theories to see where conspiracy theories were most believed and where they won't. There was an irony in this, in that between doing the poll and publishing the results, one of the conspiracy theories appeared as if it wasn't a conspiracy theory. That was the one that the Russians had been involved in the election of Trump in 2016. So you've all got to be careful about conspiracy theories, but this one I think is interesting. This is adults who believe a single secretive group rules the world. And you probably know what YouGov were getting at. And you probably know the sensitivity. You may not if you're younger, but I don't want to make an assumption. This is all about who believes in the Illuminati and is there a set of one group of people or not. But if you look at the wording of the question, You know, regardless of who's officially in charge of governments and other organisations, there's a single group of people who secretly control events and rule the world together. Well, I spent the last 13 years in the University of Oxford, and a number of billionaires and high policy people I bumped into going to secretive meetings to talk about how the world ought to be run is, you know, hundreds. You know, and we know about the ones who meet on yachts and all of this. You don't. If you're going to go to war against Iraq, you don't ask Parliament necessarily. You know, you and George get together, pray a bit, and decide you're going to have a war. So I do think it's a bit unreasonable to say that anybody who thinks that a lot of decisions are made in secret is a conspiracy theorist. But the pattern is interesting of where those beliefs are held most strongly and where they're not. Japan, Denmark, Sweden, UK, Germany. Least likely to believe that's how things work. Climate crisis. And similar graph about beliefs, which might show why you might be surprised that the climate crisis isn't higher up. We live in the country where most people are least likely to think that the climate crisis is a hoax. Right? Just 9% of people think it's a hoax. It's the lowest in the world. Whole set of things came together. It is an achievement. I ought to do a listing of things we're really good at, because the climate crisis really is true. It's the political parties, I think, quietly agreeing to not argue about this amongst themselves for votes. Okay, Kemi, a couple of days ago, has moved the net zero target to 2050 or something. Nigel and his friends want to say it's a hoax, but luckily at the moment they're arguing amongst each other at an incredible rate. The BBC decided to take a particular line and say we're not going to do balance. It's not balanced to put some... I'll try not to upset the person. In fact, the person who sent me... It's not here. More emails I've had about how climate change is a hoax doesn't live too far from this part of Scotland, I've just realised. And works in the geography department. Right. But look, we're at the bottom. Nigeria, US at the top. Climate crisis is a crisis of inequality. The weird graphs nearer are just showing the unbelievable distribution of who pollutes the most. Right? You have to log it. I ought to do it not logged. Right? It is not the world's poor who are polluting. The richer you are, the amount you pollute just doesn't go up in proportion to your wealth. It zooms off, because what you do once you've got enough money to buy the clothes you need and the food you need and the home you need, what you tend to do on average are things that are really, really polluting. Eventually you get your own private jet, yeah, rather than waste time in an aeroplane with other people. Most of the world's population never fly, never will fly. Can't fly, there aren't enough planes. You get a yacht. That's an amazing way to burn diesel and other petrols. Multiple homes to fly between. Right. You get hobbies that end up polluting. It's quite stunning. If you're really worried about climate crisis and pollution, one of the answers is fairly obvious. You have to worry about and you fund think tanks that say it's not true. It's about the most climate damaging thing you can do. But there are reasons for people's scepticism. Getting near to the end now, but this may surprise you. So, the world's been heating up. We get more adverse weather events every decade. We get more floods. We get more hurricanes. We get more storms. We do get more heat waves. And yet the number of people dying from climate-related disasters is dropping like a stone. This is good news. It used to be 77 people per million per year who died from climate-related disasters in the 1950s. I can't remember them, I wasn't there. By the 1970s, which I could just remember, the 1980s, it was 14 per million. I can remember the pictures on television. In the 2020s, so far, it's less than 1 person in every million a year dies of a climate-related disaster. Because when there are floods across Pakistan, there are mobile phones, and there's a response system. And things actually happen to avert deaths. The number of people affected doesn't fall as fast, but it's interesting. And if you're wondering why are people actually becoming less worried about climate change, One answer might be because the reality for people's lives is that these things are not yet causing the situation to get worse than it was for their parents or grandparents, directly related to things to do with the climate. The highest number of recorded heatwave deaths in the world, this is very dubious to do but hard to do, is in Europe and Russia and North America, because you need a large elderly population for heat waves to be, and the population used to it not being hot. More people die in the world at the moment from cold in winter than from it being hot in summer. The last subject is biodiversity, and then we have conclusion. So you'll be glad to know it's coming to an end. It's kind of whistle-stop tour through the worries. And there are a set of people, and I get a lot of emails from these folk, who absolutely believe it's all coming to an end in their lifetimes. This includes a disproportionate number of physical geographers, interestingly, who come up to me when I do these talks. I've only done 4, this is the 4th, and quietly say, you do know we're all doomed, Danny. And I do want to say, why are you bothering to write another paper in Nature then? You know, why are you telling me the ref matters? Anyway, or it's just a strange, I can't quite work it out, but it's, if any physical geographers want to explain that to me. But there are people who really believe, and in the subject of geography, there's some leading experts who just, we have to act now. If we don't act now, we've got 12 years, it's all going to be over. Right? Including, of course, the tundra melts, the methane goes up, the North Atlantic Oscillation ends and reverse, and so on. And including academic papers, and my favourite one is here, showing the imminent absolute collapse of human population, which has already begun, by the way. It's only that the world census doesn't show it. And I was so tempted to write to this author and tell them, you know, there isn't a world census. But people suggesting that we should put contraceptives in the water. We need to get down to 1 billion. The planet can't possibly support more than this. And quite vocal, limits to growth stuff. And it's big. Out there. My take is that the most remarkable thing has happened in terms of population, that if you're young and female in the audience, or young and male and very, very careful when you're crossing the road, then you will be the first humans in the history of our species to actually watch the population stabilise, currently predicted to be the year 2084. We've never had fewer young people being born. We are heading to something quite utterly remarkable. And it's already on the cards. It began in the 1960s when we were growing at 2% a year. We're now growing at much less than 1% a year. Every time the United Nations produces the next estimates, it turns out they're overestimating growth. Turns out young people are going to have fewer children each time than we thought they were going to have. The only reason that the population's going up is that people like me are not dying, right? It's just aging. And we're looking at something really interesting and very, very good news. You know, because there is a limit. I don't know whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 billion really well-organised people. But the limit is also 2 billion very selfish, not well-organised humans. But there is a limit. Conclusion. To save time, I'm not going to read you that. I'll leave it up. But it's the hopeful one about, I'll put it up at the end, so we'll come back to that. It's what is actually possible in an ecological future world, long quote. Let's skip that. This is the last slide. So I'm not sanguine about these things. My position is that the things that people worry about the most really, really matter. They cause people an immense personal agony, worry and fear. Most of the world's middle class are worried, let alone the working class and the poor. Most of the world's middle class are really scared about how they're going to get enough just to get by. Because they're not in the top 10% or top 1% or top 1 in 1,000. And they know that the top 1% are not going to sort things out for them and give them the sunlit uplands and give them growth and trickle down, right? We're past that, way, way past thinking that that's anything in that. And when you still hear prime ministers telling you growth's the answer, of course you should be afraid, because the people in charge don't appear to have got it yet. And unemployment is an absolute fear. Why are mental health so high amongst young people? Because your futures are not certain. When I got into university in 1986, that was it. I was sorted. Only 10% of people got into university. Get into university, you're fine. Generation before me, didn't matter going into university because we had full employment. If you didn't like your job, you told your boss to shove it and you got another one. Right? Now, 65% of people in the UK go to university by the age of 30. 2/3, the highest in Europe. We introduced marketisation and fees. 65% go to university. But don't worry, it's going to make you really rich, being part of the 2/3. Right? We really hope you can't do the maths. Right? So, you're not going to get rich that way. Maybe you can work hard. Maybe you're going to be lucky. But if you're not in the top 10%, you're not going to be able to get a mortgage. Your children won't be able to go to the school you might want them to send to. You're not going to be having holidays. 1 in 3 children have no holidays at all. So you've really got to fight for your place in this society. So no wonder mental health's so high. That's why unemployment matters. I've left that up there so you can see the rest. The crises that most people in the world say are the biggest crises are the biggest crises. The solutions are remarkably similar. They're about not being greedy, about sharing, about controlling inequality, reducing it, getting it down to levels in the countries that do best in the world, which also have the best health services and so on. Not believing the rhetoric that gets you into this position, looking at the United States and going, oh no, that's where you end up if you believe that set of things. That's what you see. It's a terrible thing that's happening in the United States, but it's had a really remarkable effect on debate in the rest of the world. Right? It can happen. It is possible. There are people who want a night watchman state who really honestly believe that if you get rid of government, everything gets better, and you just get some spaceships and you put some white people on them and you can go to Mars and create a new colony. And they're currently in power in the world's most powerful country. Right? So no wonder we've got a sense of crisis, but there are alternatives. I'll put the very long quote back for anybody who wants to read it. Thank you for your patience, and please ask me some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Marvellously thought-provoking. So we have a lot of time for questions. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask something. And we've got a lot already, so I'm going to take a few at once.
Take two at a time.
Take two at a time. And if you don't mind saying who you are, because we've got a whole mix of people here, say who you are, that would be helpful. So Dan, and then Jess, and then I'll come to Joe and Dan.
Sorry, I'll try and get it quick, so I've actually got to go to a meeting, but I'm really sorry about that. It's fascinating. I've got a question in terms of the geography. As you know, you rightly talked about the significance of geography now for understanding these things. And this is to do with what you were telling us there in terms of the survey data globally and the actuality and perception of crisis. And there are various words that kind of came in and out of your conversation. I wanted you to maybe say a few things more about the question of scale, the geography term scale. And that comes in two kind of different theses I think you'll know full well about from the academic literature, but it might be worth looking more generally, is the first view, which comes from a lot of sociologists, is that the crisis of global modernity, either actual or perceived, is the crisis of the nation-state. And in and out, we talk a lot about the state. So that's one view. The other view, which comes from a lot of actually dissident writers around the world, I'm thinking Wang Yang, the brilliant one, who put 5 revolutions that growing up in China, is about how the perception and actuality of crisis today falls predominantly on individuals now rather than communities and societies, which is a very different scale than the nationals. And that, those two positions, I think, kind of filtered in and out of your talk, and it's for the benefit of the wider group. Maybe you want to say something more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jessica. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Ecology. Thanks so much for your talk. I was keen to hear a more optimistic argument, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the climate change chapter fits, because in political ecology and environmental justice debates, it seems kind of an expected result, because the crucial argument is that this inequality of climate change is also that it's experienced so disproportionately across North and South, and it's precisely the people that didn't answer your survey that are the environmental defenders or environmentalism of the poor kind of literatures who are not active in it. So it seems kind of expected that lots of people aren't worrying about climate change because they're not the ones who are being impacted, and actually the voices of the people who are being so impacted or are trying to do something about it are not included in the data. So I just wondered if you could speak to the extent to which you think that matters and where climate change comes into this more hopeful story.
Okay, I can only hold two questions in my head at a time. The crisis of the state. The states are a relatively recent thing. We're sitting in a very odd place for that because this is an old state of Scotland and an old state of England. And if you look at the European map of states 500 years ago, you can see why people loads of tiny principalities and wars. So we tend to blame our inability to organise things now on something being wrong with our states. But we don't have 20 separate planet Earths which allow us to work out what the scenarios would be under different things. I don't think that the problem is that we try to organise things at the state level. I do think that states of a certain size that are smaller, where people can care about each other, 5 to 10 million people do better. And I particularly like the Heineken plan for Europe, which Freddie Heineken does the beer. He hired 2 historians to create a future map of Europe. So if you're interested, just type Heineken map. But we have to have a way of organising ourselves. Another set of people I get a lot of emails from, it's great getting emails, I reply to emails, are anarchists who just say, and I say just because you could tell I'm not an anarchist, we need to organise ourselves better at community level, we can provide our housing, we can do this, we can farm organically. It just doesn't scale up. And the most successful part of the world for improving the conditions of people is a state, and it's called China. And we can either pretend that hasn't happened or isn't happening, or we can look at it and learn from it. The implications falling on people is something that happens particularly here and in the US. In the US, they will abandon entire cities. You get ghost towns. Here we stop short of that. There was a plan to have some ghost towns in County Durham to let Liverpool die, but we never did that. But we still do blame the individual. You work hard, it's up to you. Do well in your A-levels, work hard at university, you'll be fine. And if you don't get a good job, it's down to you. And most people in Britain, most middle-class people, suck at that and believe it. If I just worked a bit harder, it would be me. It makes absolutely no sense. You can't all be in the 1%. And to be honest, the people who do end up in the 1% are much more often narcissistic, nasty, step on other people's necks. They're not the kind of people you'd want to be. But you go outside of the UK, and very often it's much more collective about worrying about the town, the community, what happens. In Wales, there's a phrase, if you go to a funeral in Wales, if you hear the phrase, he was a man of his square mile, it means he actually cared about people around him, and it normally often hear it. You don't hear it for women because you just assume that women will care about people around them, I'm told by friends in Wales. So, different things have happened in different parts of the world. We are, by income inequality, the most unequal country in Europe now. We are shattered. as the UK. That's, and that means that it's particularly individualistic. The who's most affected? The low-lying islands, people in India. It's really difficult at the moment I've been trying to count the damage, and I've been looking at IPCC reports, and endless ones, and it's hard to count. So the majority of the heat-related deaths are elderly people in affluent countries. They're not recorded yet in India. So the mantra is, this is going to affect the poor the most. But when you actually try to measure who's affected the most, and who has been affected, now we're at 1.5 degrees, it is richer, more elderly people who have, which should concern us, because you're hoping to get to 85 or 90. The 1 billion climate refugees has now been put down and down and down to less than tens of thousands. It's tricky, but this is where I'm probably going to get torn apart the most in the book. Or the example in the UK, we've only abandoned one village in the UK yet because of sea level rise. It's the village of Fairbourne in Gwynedd in Wales. And the Welsh government said they were no longer going to defend it because the sea's going to rise and Fairbourne will be lost to the sea. And it meant that the property values in Fairbourne sank from already being incredibly low to almost unsellable to sell your house in Fairbourne. They've now backtracked because Fairbourne isn't going to be lost to the sea because sea level rise won't do it. So the problem is that the biggest damage done was by people saying that they were worried about this, but actually damaging the folk. So it's not easy to actually. I think the biggest change in lives are going to be for the rich. We're not going to be able to jet around on cheap holidays in future. It makes no sense. We're not going to be able to heat our homes and have windows open and no insulation because we don't actually care about the fuel bill. We're going to change our taxation systems to make people behave properly. But this has huge implications for the lives of the very, very rich. And it's easy to say that the poorest are most affected, but the evidence that they are is much harder to actually bring together. That's been my experience. Yet, a lot of this is all about what's going to happen. To give you some sense of the oddness of this debate, the IPCC summaries express greater confidence about what's going to happen in future than they express about what has happened in the past. So there's more disagreement amongst the experts in the IPCC about the record of what has occurred in the last 10, 20 and 30 years than about the future. We also don't know. That's a really important thing. So we tend to talk about the central estimate and 2 degrees, 2.5. We don't talk because we don't really want to scare people into a complete apathy about the nightmare scenarios of sudden much higher cooling. So I'm not saying there isn't a huge problem. I'm just saying the population of the planet increasingly think of it as less of a problem because we've cried wolf so often and because it's so often the very richest of us who go on about this. And that's beginning to annoy some folk. And it's going to be used. So Reform are planning to use climate change as one of their things to get votes. And then we're into really dangerous territory. But it's the most contentious part of the book, hence why it's stuck right back in chapter 7, not at least. Because if you work in a geography department with 100 climate change scientists, and you publish a book about crises that says actually the thing that you're working on every day for most people in the world is not the most important thing for the future of their families themselves, going back to scale, I expect not to be popular for a couple of months in my own department. But the book's timed to come out just before the summer holidays and long vacation. So by October they might be talking to me again. But I've shared drafts with my colleagues, and the common response has been these people have been asked the wrong question. And that isn't the right response to trying to understand what people's concerns are.
Dan and Joe, and then other people who come and then I'll come back to you.
Dan Robinson, a Stephen Fellow at University yeah, that's really interesting. So I saw a talk last month from Professor at University of Waterloo, Eric Hallinan, about an idea he was working with about polycrisis. So actually we've got these kind of multiple crises and they're all interdependent. So I was just wondering what you thought about that in terms of like how you could see, like instead of saying this is the most important thing or this is the most important, actually they're all kind of very much reliant on each other and they affect each other obviously. So maybe the interdependent and polycrisis is a potential way of solving this issue of people disagreeing about which is the most important.
Joe Morrison, postdoc on my project at St Andrews. My question is very similar. I wanted you to reflect. Ironically, you finished in with the dismissal of it's the wrong question, but it seems like it is the wrong question because these things are interdependent, and I don't think you can really reduce someone's worries to one phrase. I know you divided it, that's not you. I'm not saying you, but how do you navigate that? I can think that inequality is a huge issue, but I think inequality is a huge issue because it is what sets violence in a lot of cases. So I think that these interventions like that are basically, so it's kind of the same question, but how would you rectify that my criticism and cynicism if you could design something differently?
Thank you. You kind of guess the end of the book, which does say the solutions to all of these are remarkably similar because they're all causing each other's problem. One reason why we don't have enough work for all, in the case of the UK, 10% of us are taking 40% of all income. We're leaving 60% of national income for 90% of the population and then trying to employ them on that small amount of money and telling them they could do things like get on the bike and deliver us a pizza. We're recreating a servant class. That the best off of us simply have too much money. But the reality of that's really hard to stomach. You say in an ideal situation, when your university does a pay and conditions awards, as mine have just done, people like me should be facing a real terms cut of 1 or 2%. If we're going to get the salaries of the people who actually run and clean my university to be decent at the bottom end in Oxford. Easy for me to say. My wife has a car, I don't. I share it. We've got one car. We've got one house. My kids go to school and we don't pay for them to go to school. I like camping. My wife doesn't, but I do like camping. Right? But I can be cynical about this, but if you want a good example of why it's really hard to get the rich to give things up, look at the 2017 or 2019 manifestos of the Labour Party. The manifestos of the Labour Party in 2019 would, if had been enacted, moved us to be almost as equal as Germany. It would have reduced our inequalities to almost the German level, European average. It would have increased our public spending. It would have destroyed things like the private sector of education because people wouldn't have had enough money. So the example I always give is North London Collegiate School. You're high up on the board of the Guardian newspaper. You're paying for your daughter to go to North London Collegiate. You have a small villa in Tuscany that you share with somebody else for the summer holidays. Maybe a little house in the Brecon Beacons and a mortgage to pay. And not having 40% of all income in your 10% group is absolutely life-changing. If you want to understand why the Guardian abandoned the Labour Party and went for Boris Johnson and Brexit, which is a controversial thing to say, it's the fear, the absolute fear, when you're at the top of giving it up. You can talk about it theoretically. The only way to do it fairly is the national government increases taxation at the top, says you can't have these pay increases. This has happened before. It happened in the 1920s, 1930s, and the 40s and 50s. It's not pie in the sky. You can get greater equality. Every other country in Europe, apart from Bulgaria, has it. most countries in Europe have rising equality, right? It's entirely possible, but the implications for your life if you're well off are very big. So it's a polycrisis, but the people who are going to have to give up most are the people who are writing the books and buying the books. You don't go into a bookshop and spend 16 quid on a book now in Britain unless you're doing pretty well. And it's that we've got ourselves into a really odd situation where if you're rich, it's okay to talk about the climate and species, but not to talk about all the other things, which is why nothing's going to be done to solve the climate and species, because people can't actually get by and are in such fear. And that's where I'm most controversial about this. And I think the solutions are great. I think it's fine to just have one home and not have second homes and so on. I think it's okay not to go abroad very much on holiday, not much more than other people. I do think we shouldn't have what's now rising to 40% of children having no holiday in a year. And those holidays would largely be in Britain. Whereas people like me, I'm off to Finland on Friday, it's a holiday. I'm going to have another holiday this summer. You might say, but Danny, you should be giving all this up. I will, as long as you do too. And how do we get that? That's what a national government does, right? That's why it needs to be national government policy. And when I can't fly and see my nice friend in Finland because my pay hasn't gone up and my taxes have, so we can actually fund the health service, I won't be getting on that plane at Heathrow. And I won't be putting those tons of carbon into the atmosphere of my flight for my holiday. But it's a national government solution. But to get it, the most powerful group in the country need to be partly on board, and they're us, they're the rich. We got a welfare state in 1945 because William Beveridge, the really rich man, wanted it, and a whole set of ministers agreed with him. You know, and it's until the rich actually want something, it's very, very hard to get it to happen. Now, the rich do want climate change sorted. They are worried about biodiversity. But giving up the trappings of being well off, that's much harder to do. So I would link the crises together, but say the lives that are going to have to change the most are our lives and what we imagine for our children and grandchildren. And that's why we haven't done the obvious thing, because it's really hard to give up this thing that you've won by working so hard, getting those exam results at school, getting that university degree, getting those jobs, and getting so much more than other people. And getting into a situation where you don't even have to worry about being made unemployed. Right? And that's our problem in this very, very unequal country.
Yeah, thank you. My name is George. I'm a student here. This is my first exposure to the field of geography, and I think this is really interesting stuff. I have questions about what it actually means to be concerned and worried. So, regarding your third chapter, you showed that worry about Brexit dropped as worry about COVID was increasing in 2019.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there's sort of like one pool of worry, or like are we worrying more or less in different years? And then also, do you see any correlation between the amount of concern there is about an issue and actual change happening for that issue?
Okay.
Thank you, Danny. I'm Paolo, a teacher, the economist teacher at local school. The question I have is, you've obviously done a lot of work in surveys. Being an economist teacher, I'm obviously pleased that economic issues feature at top inflation. I think the simulation at that time past was the 1970s when we had high inflation. You've looked at surveys a lot. I like that you had surveys going back in the 2010s to see what the concerns were. Have you looked into surveying back into the 1970s and when inflation dropped out as an issue, when it dropped out?
Okay.
I'm also interested in how you ask these questions. Are you just asking what other issues that you're concerned with, or is it given a pair of issues, which one are you most concerned with?
Yeah. Okay. They're related. So I'm using other people's survey results. So the only discerning thing I do is I like Ipsos. I think they're the safest. YouGov not so much. but I've looked at surveys. The longest running set of surveys we have are election surveys, I think beginning around about 1951. So since 1951 we've asked people in elections, and then we've had British Social Attitude Survey, which is very good, but just 1,000 people and asks about everything. And then we get the polling companies coming in. At most 4 or 5 issues tend to dominate at any one time for an election result. Doesn't mean there are more things, but what I should have done before we started, and I should have talked for less and had fewer graphs, I should have got bits of paper or some system on your phone, Slido, and it's really hard because you don't really want to prompt people as soon as you put up a list, right? But maybe we should have done a word cloud and just got everybody to write in their top 1 or 2 concerns and then worked out about you, about the world, and put it up. But we'd find quite a lot of similarity in this room, probably, just to do with timing and where we are and who we are. But it's not a huge number of issues that are high. Sometimes they fight against it. The classic 2 in election studies are inequality and immigration. So if you're a right-wing newspaper, if you're owned by a rich family, and why do they own you as a newspaper, or your GB News, one of your jobs is to tell people constantly for over a century the reason why you've got a problem with the schools for your children, or you can't get a house, or you can't get the job you want. Well, that's the immigrants who are coming and taking it away from you. It was the Jews coming in 1905. It was the people from the Caribbean. It's always the immigrants. They're always taking it away from you. Right? The reason why you can't get a house is not the immigrants. Immigrants build houses. Right? They grow economies. Right? Immigration is related to economic growth. It's when people leave an area, you've got trouble. The reason you can't have a house, we've actually got more houses per person we've ever had. We've got more rooms than we ever had. It's because some people have got a lot of them. Right? It's the inequality in the distribution of housing. Why can't you get your kid into the school you want to get them into? Because we have the most unequal set of schools in Europe. You go to Finland, you just go to the nearest one. They're all brilliant and much better than any of ours. Right? But we have the most unequal set of schools. We've got more school buildings per child than anywhere else in Europe. We've got more teachers. Right? It's not the immigrants coming and filling up your school. Health service. And again, rather obviously, it's not people coming from abroad, it's inequality. We had, in this country, the best health record in the world in the 1950s and 60s by a tiny number of small countries. It's possible to do that, but you have to have a system which is set up that says the greater your need for healthcare, the more healthcare you're going to get, and the amount of money you have has no impact on that. Last year, 1 in 10 people in Britain, of everybody, not just ill people, 1 in 10 people use private healthcare. Can't get your teeth fixed without a private dentist, you can't get a hip operation, a knee operation, a cataract. And all that use, and teeth whitening, plastic surgery, other things, doesn't really matter whether it needs to be done. If you've got the money to pay for it, you can get the operation. And then the result is that people who actually need operations are not getting operations. Right? So these things are related. But it's going back to surveys, it's using other people's surveys who think about surveys and interpreting them, but think about things differently. So if you take inflation in the 1970s, the fascinating thing about inflation in the 70s is that in most years in the 70s, wages went up by more than inflation. It was unbelievable. We get histories of the 70s. I was there, only just. But I did knock up twice in 1974 for one political party at the age of 6. In most years in the 70s, people got better off. Their wages went up on average more than the inflation. The strikes were won in the 1970s. Miners won a big strike in 1973. The highest quality of life ever measured was in 1974, particularly for men. The average life expectancy in Sheffield was better than national average in the 70s. Still in full employment until about 77, 78, 79. The people who lost out in the 70s, I always put it cruelly, Dominic Sandbrook is a historian younger than me who wrote about the 70s despite the fact he wasn't there. The people who missed out in the 70s were Dominic Sandbrook's family, the wealthy. If you've got inflation going at 20% in a year, and say you've got, I don't know, £50,000 worth of stocks and shares in the bank, and they're suddenly worth 20% less, that's really bad news. So the 70s are demonised because of what occurred when we came together. And it was a shock, and it resulted in a set of folk working really hard to reverse the governments that were in charge. We got a government came in 1979, took tax limits right round, there was cheering in the city, and we had the biggest increase in inequality that anywhere in Europe has ever seen. Quite staggering. And that's my story of the 70s. Very different to one that's... But I do hold the 1971 chair of geography. Partly called 1971 chair because the 70s were so good. But I have to write a book on the 70s. And we had chopper bikes, and we had funk music. But I'll stop there.
Okay, I think we'll make this our last set of questions for people who have been waiting a while. So, do you manage 4 down in 4 quick ones?
Yes.
Okay. Ladies towards the back there, and here, and here. Did you have your hand up there? No. In front of Joe, did you want to ask a question?
When you speak about the last 2 chapters in the book about climate crisis, where they ask you I feel, and I have a debate this why is the Western world with friend. It kind of contradicts with the space in which the climate sort of narrative of this course, by the last conservation is being proposed. And then it creates a disconnect that doesn't necessarily lie with the
Okay, thank you.
I'm Peter Kushner, live here in town. I thank you for your talk very much. I was wondering if I could appeal to your side as the public intellectual and ask you to change tone slightly, picking up on this notion of hope that you had in the slide, and speak to the younger people in the room as an educator, and to, let's say, inspire a bit and put some fight in the science that you, I think, articulated with some restraint.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Rather than go to an archaeologist, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Heartily agree with you. I probably the same section as you. I think about relative peace now. But how do you actually measure relative peace?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm a PhD student in Edinburgh in energy economics, and I wanted to ask if there are historical examples where pure policy kind of interventions made a society much more equal than the last thing.
Okay, great. Let me try that. So I'll try and do them all together in a way. I do hope. So you mentioned at the beginning that these contradictions are really important. We have more and more staff in geography departments who are not from Britain. And they're often quite quiet, but pointing out things that we get very wrong that we think are normal, and there are contradictions. So it's interesting. You mentioned roads must fall, if you don't know. There is a statue on the high street of my town. I was born in Oxford, I grew up there. A statue of a man called Cecil Rhodes, which is the highest statue on the high street. He was a murderer and a racist and a bigot. And his statue is the only statue of a man so evil over the entrance of any educational institution in Europe. We don't have statues of Hitler over schools in Germany, right? We just don't do that. But Rhodes is still there. Rhodes will go one day. The school I went to had a house named after Rhodes. In 1989, the children refused to play on Sports Day. Sports Day, the houses go against each other, the children refused to run, the school had to rename it. Right? So you can change things. Right? Getting rid of that statue in Oxford is one of the hardest things. There are people who really believe it's important that young people have to walk under a statue of a racist bigot to go into their college. It's unbelievable, and it will go one day. The only question is how it goes. The hope part, and I think you're right, I ought to move this around a bit more, is there is a terrible sense, if you look at European surveys of young adults, there is a sense that we're doomed. It's all over. The climate crisis means it's doomed. Young European adults, and including in Britain, tend to be progressive on almost every social issue. They're against racism, they're against people not being allowed to be who they want to be, they're against misogyny, and so on. The only thing that young European graduates are in favour of, ironically, is income inequality, in that they think they should be paid more than other people because they've gone to university, which is not what we fought in the 60s and 70s, right? So something's kind of the idea that you should be paid more than other people because you spent 3 years not having to stack shelves. But the world isn't ending, it's not going to end in 12 years. It would be really, really good if we got the amount of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere down as fast as possible, rather than try and design ways to pump it into kind of landfill and into fissures in the rock where oil used to be. Right? We really just have to stop polluting as the main thing. But it's possible to do that. An example of hope of a government policy. The most dramatic government policy across the whole of Europe to reduce child poverty. Do you want that since 1989? Okay. The most effective. Imagine a country in which 2 out of every 7 children are very poor and their parents can't afford to heat their homes, so they're going cold in the winter, really cold, and they can't afford to feed them. And imagine if that country, taking the whole of Europe, and the people running that country, the government, we talked about what governments can do, the government of the country decides it has enough of this. And a few years ago it decides to give every family in those poorest 2/7 £10 a week for every child under 6 that's in there, a little bit of money. And then it increases it, and it decides it's going to give that extra money to every family with a child under 16, and it's going to increase the amount of money to about £25 a week. Then it increases it a little bit more, so that your family of 3, and you're going to get every year from the government £4,000 a year. 4,000. So that your family need not go cold and your children need not go hungry. Right? And this really, really happened. This policy really happened. And the place it happened is an obscure little European country called Scotland. Right? And it happened about 3 or 4 years ago. And it happened because of the policies of the government of Scotland, the SNP, and it happened because there was a fight within the Scottish Labour Party, and those people in the Scottish Labour Party who wanted to attack this policy decided to be quiet, and so Scotland still has a Scottish child payment. And so in theory, if it's distributed for the whole of the United Kingdom, the only place where no child need go cold or hungry is Scotland. Just the government. It was pushed by one First Minister who she had 2 objectives. One was independence. The other thing she really hated, because she grew up in Glasgow and like Wham, she really hated was child poverty. Right? And you can go on and on of policies that governments have done, free, almost free train travel, securing no homelessness. The reason I'm going to Finland on Friday is I'm going to spend a week with the man in charge of the ministry that ended homelessness in that country. Right? It's unbelievable what you can do. You just really don't want the experience of having grown up in Britain recently to give you faith in what is possible. And also people become cynical. Everywhere in the world, people say, it's not enough, it's not good enough. Right? Even when they manage to achieve schooling systems, which are the envy of the world, or in our case, a housing system after the Second World War, which was the envy of the world, or a health service. People become cynical to the achievements. And there are people who don't want you to think that these things are achievements because they want to be left alone. They want no regulation. They want their 200 or 300 or 400 billion to become 500 billion because they really, really, really want to build rockets and create a colony on Mars. Now, it's never going to work. Mars is too far away. But the danger of allowing a small group of men, 5 of the world's 7 richest men stood behind Donald Trump in the inauguration of him. And the danger of letting those men get away with what they want and what they want to happen to the rest of human society, that's your big worry. And you either think that 8 billion people are incapable and 5 men are going to beat them, or you can be a bit hopeful because, it's an odd time, it isn't going to last, and we're getting to watch it play out at the moment.
I think that reasonable hopeful note is a good principle. Before we crank Danny, I'd like to point out these 3 books that are over here. They're not Danny's, but they are about surveys, crisis and inequality, so do take one if you'd like one. Thank you all very, very much for joining us.